Hello, everybody. My name is Fawzi. I'm going to talk to you today about effective prototyping. Let me tell you a little bit about myself first before we dive into it. So I'm originally from Jordan. I'm a game designer. I've been working in video games, and I'm originally from Jordan. There, I worked in a bunch of independent companies. I worked in a bunch of different types of games. I worked on PC, 360 games. I worked on Facebook browser games. I worked on music trivia games. I worked on a very stereotypical farming game. And then I collaborated with Atlas for a while, and we worked on the Persona franchise. I worked on the Persona 3 iteration with the offices in Bangkok. From Jordan, I took a small detour to New Zealand, where I joined Gameloft. I was the principal game designer there. This is a picture of me, the My Little Pony team, and the Prime Minister of New Zealand at the time, Mr. John Key. We worked with the team there on My Little Pony, but worked on a bunch of IP-based games as well. I worked on Ice Age Adventures. Here's a picture of me with some penguins. Worked on Littlest Pet Shops, Pastry Paradise, Amazing Spider-Man 2, and then we collaborated with our studios in Spain on Minion Rush, based on Despicable Me movie license. That game at the time was amongst the top 10 most downloaded iOS games of all time. I think still is, and it's one of two games that I worked on that are on that list. From Gameloft, I took another detour to Japan, where I worked at Inish, subsidiaries, where we did collaboration with Square Enix, Gree, and Glue Mobile. Worked in the Tokyo office. I was the only person on my team that was not Japanese. I worked on a lot of games that were mostly owned for the Japanese market. I was the creative director at the studio at the time. Worked on a bunch of games that were for Japanese market only. You probably won't know many of them, but I will tell them about it anyway. Worked on Senden no Kyoshin, 12 Odins, Yurukami, and Crouton, amongst others. From Japan, I took another detour to Germany, where I was the head of design and production for the King office in Berlin. We were looking after the Candy Crush franchise, working on Candy Crush Jelly and Candy Crush Original. We were also known as the studio with the slide. And here's a picture of Angela Merkel trying to create a Candy Crush level in our studio. From Germany, I took a smallest detour so far. I moved to Sweden, where I joined DICE. Currently I'm the head of design of DICE. So I'm looking after all of the designers in the studio, whether level design, UX design, game design, etc. It's a large group of people, around 80 plus designers. And I'm also looking after both franchises, the Battlefront franchise and the Battlefield franchises. So I'm responsible for the design and the creative development. I'm also part of the studio leadership team over there. Last year, I launched my book. It's called Al-Khalab and the Art of Game Design. It's the first book to be written on game design in Arabic. It's a textbook that aims to teach young youth in the Middle East about game development with resources that don't require them to learn another language. I've also written a bunch of comic books back in the day, around 9 of them. Those meant to create superheroes in the Middle East. I co-authored 9 of them that went to sell around 5 million copies across the MENA region. I also like to talk and speak in conferences quite a bit, similar to this one. I teach in universities of game design in any country I live in. I just finished a course in Future Game here in Stockholm. I'm a jury member of the International Mobile Games Awards. I'm also a jury member of the Game Developers Choice Awards. I'm a Google mentor, and I work with those guys quite a bit and like helping indie developers and youth and smaller companies get their projects off the ground. And I also co-established the IGDA chapter in Berlin while I was there. So enough about me. Let's talk about prototyping. So let's go with some simple introduction about what is prototyping. So prototyping is basically creating a working model of an idea to be able to test it and make sure that it works before we start implementing it in the game. So the idea of prototyping is that if it's only playable, we need to make a rough approximation of what we're trying to test out, whether it's artwork, sound, and features. Why do we need to do prototyping? Because in the prototyping phase, you get to test the riskiest part of the things that you're working on or the gameplay ideas that you're more concerned with, without worrying about perfecting technology or the look or how the art is going to look like. So it's basically focusing on the fundamental mechanics and making sure that these mechanics sustain the interest of people, so that we make sure that when we go into production and we're actually building these things, that we're not going to spend a lot of time and effort into building something that would cost us a lot and people would hate, basically. Many different types of prototyping that you can utilize in building games, from physical prototyping to visual prototyping, video, and software, everybody's favorite, digital prototypes. Physical prototyping is the easiest type of prototyping. That means that most game designers will be able to construct these things on their own, be based using slips of paper, cardboard, household objects, pretty much anything you can get your hands on, and use hand-drawn markings to test these things. Physical prototypings are pretty good because they allow you to focus on the gameplay rather than the technology or how to build the game. Allows you to build and to iterate quickly. You can oftentimes be able to respond in real time to the feedback to players as they're testing the physical prototype. It's pretty cheap. It doesn't cost you much. The team is less likely to be attached to their idea since it's still a physical prototype that is roughly a throwaway hunk of junk. And it also allows the non-technical team members to also participate in a design process themselves. There are many examples of physical prototypes. Like the thing on the left is probably the most common example, which is sheets of paper, dice, and physical objects and cubes to kind of to illustrate an idea. The picture on the right, this is Hideo Kojima during the development of Metal Gear 2, is one of the more extreme examples of physical prototyping. When they were making the first Metal Gear, he was kind of frustrated with how many, or maybe his programmers were more frustrated with him, that he wanted to do a lot of revisions to the shots in which, the cinematic shots of the game in which he's telling the story, because he wanted to change the camera angle or something like that. So in the development of Metal Gear 2, they rebuilt the entire levels using Legos. And they developed this technology that allowed him to use the camera, a handheld camera, which is this thing on the by his right arm there, to basically frame the shots using the physical prototype to be able to translate into the game easily. And that allowed him to do a lot more changes later on. It's not that common to physically prototype level design in Lego, but I thought it's an amusing example of a successful game that did that as well. So when you're doing physical prototyping, please don't pay much attention to the quality of the artwork. Make sure that you playtest the game yourself first before you put it in front of others, then invite them to test it and make quick iterations as they're going. You're more likely to see that there are issues with your prototype as you're testing it with others, and you can make the changes. Oftentimes, students and others ask me about how do you translate some real-time mechanics into a physical prototype. So how do I represent random elements or time? So basically, you can use dice or card decks to simulate random elements. You can use grid spaces to represent movement. And you can use turns to represent time. You can also combine all three to have a combination of grids and random elements to represent the movement during time, for example. Visual prototyping is a different aspect of it. So if you ever stood on a whiteboard and sketched something to a team member to try to illustrate an idea, you've done some form of visual prototyping. So you could start from using a piece of paper on a whiteboard to a very rough diagram or representation of core actions in a game's prototype is a form of visual prototyping. It can go into different types. You can do a detailed step-by-step interaction or a storyboard of what would happen as you're working towards a certain set of events in a storyboard fashion, similar to what it's applied in the movie industry. A different way in games is to apply a concept art. So instead of spending a lot of time into actually going into the game and building the scenes yourself, the concept art will help you set out some of the aspects of the tone and lighting and level creations and that kind of stuff way before you start building in the game engine. And it helps you set the scene, and you can iterate on the concept art until you get the feel and look that you're looking to achieve. And also different departments and use different type of techniques in prototyping, and animatic is a way to visualize how things would look like in motion without really investing a lot of time into actually putting them in motion. this will probably be a conversation in its own right that will take a lot to converse. So I'm just going to touch base on this quickly and move on. More important types of visual prototyping will include you testing the usability and the feasibility of your UI. There are many software that will enable you to quickly prototype interactive elements and layouts and see what works the best and what is the easiest to understand by your user base. And then it's everybody's favorite, like I mentioned earlier, digital prototyping is basically building things that and interactive elements and core systems and anything that you have questions about, such as your logics or special physics or environment or something like that. So jumping directly into software to try to simulate some of those ideas. Digital prototyping, it should be made with as little art or sound or investment into making it look pretty as possible. You don't have to worry about everything around the gameplay. You should be focusing around the things that you want to test out the more. So the gameplay aspect is not complete. And focusing only on the unanswered questions part of that design. You need to look at different ways to do digital prototyping. So sometimes if you're like prototyping an economy-based system, you probably don't want to build that in an engine. You can probably get a lot of these tests done in an Excel sheet that you put together. And an advice that I give to a lot of people is to try to prototype in a different language or a different system than the one you're actually building the game to. That will help you avoid a common pitfall of eventually evolving the prototype into the game, and then you're going to have to deal with the spaghetti code that you basically put in to begin with, and some of the hacky processes that you put in as throwaway, and then becomes part of your system that you need to deal with going forward. So the idea of prototyping is to be able especially in digital prototyping, is that you can be able to do small and fast throwaway projects. So instead of constantly iterating on one project, you want to do a small project, do a couple of iterations, and then throw it away, and then come up with something else. This is the essence of rapid prototyping. It means that you need to come up with a potential solution, try it out. If that doesn't work, come up with another one, and then move on. But eventually you need to work quick and dirty so that you can find out if the solutions that you're proposing or your hypotheses are correct or not. Many different types of tools that you can use in digital prototyping, from programming languages to game engines to level editors. So you can even like prototype some things in 3D softwares or Sketch or Maya or whatever thing you have. And the tool itself doesn't matter. It's all about finding out what is the thing you want to test out and evaluate first, and then going and attempting to do that as quick as possible. So going through like some of the major prototyping types, I think it's from my experience of like working with a lot of teams and working with a lot of different types of prototyping, these are common mistakes that I've seen a lot of people make. And I've seen a lot of these mistakes being made by amateur developers or students all the way to people who have been doing this for decades. So these are common prototyping mistakes that I would urge you to please notice yourself as you're doing them and try to avoid them going forward. So mistake number one is not allocating time for prototyping, so that scheduling a direct jump from theoretical or paper design immediately into building the game. That means that there's a lot of unanswered questions or things that you were very certain of in theory, but you never tested out. That means that you will have to answer these questions during development. And depending on the scale of your development process, that could be quite expensive and quite costly. You could also face a situation that as you're trying to test these things or make them work during development, that those things actually don't work. And if they were core to your development or to your project, then that could have a disastrous effect on your game. The second part is no time boxing to the prototyping process, and that means like having an open-ended prototyping process. A creative endeavor is never complete. Someone once said, a game is like any piece of art, it's never finished but abandoned. That means that you can always make something better, and even in a prototype, you can always iterate and come up with new hypotheses to try to solve for issues. And oftentimes you'll find solutions, and those solutions will cause different types of problems, and then you will try to solve for those. Without a time box, that process might consume a lot of your time. and then you would notice that you'll be eating up on your development time and you may not be able to ship. Time boxing is crucial, and it means that even though you can see the finish line of like the end of the end of your time boxing, and you can see like maybe if I iterate 4 or 5 times, I could solve this problem. I think having a time box would allow you to accept that, hey, this would have taken more time to finish off. Maybe it's time to move on to something else. Other thing that I've seen a lot of people fall into this mistake is not having clear goal for this prototype. So like not knowing exactly what this prototype is supposed to achieve. It's important for you every time as you're attempting to go into a prototyping phase to ask yourself, why are we prototyping this? How do we know that this prototype is a success? How do we measure that success? And no, checking if this is fun is not a goal. This is also a very common issue that people go like, let's try to prototype this and see if it's fun or not. That is not a measurement. How would you know that this is fun? What is fun for you? How do you measure that you've arrived at that finish line? Without having a strong hypothesis or a strong validation about how you're going to attempt to identify what those issues are, then you might be going in circles without really achieving what you want to do. You need to know what you're prototyping for. This is also a very common issue, is that you fall in love with your idea, and that means you're going to work desperately and prototype desperately in trying to prove it to work rather than fail. So you need to be able, the whole point of the prototyping process is that you need to know if something is not working so that you give up on it. And not giving up on something that's working is, as if you're talking to a lot of entrepreneurs or independent developers, they will tell you that that was one of the downfalls of how they ended up not working out, because they just fell in love with an idea, ignored the feedback about how it's not working, and then just kept on going. Another common mistake that I see is go like, oh, in order for us to really collect good feedback from people, that prototype needs to be presentable. This is a lot of wasted effort because you're focusing on all the wrong things. You're not focusing on what really matters, and you're making it harder to throw away later because you've invested so much time in making this look nice. You go like, yeah, well, maybe we can build on this and make it the game, which will cause you so many troubles when you go into production. And the whole essence of prototyping is to be throwaway. So the more effort you put into making it look nice or making it sound nice and all of that, the more likely it is for you to fall in love with it, which is mistake number 4, as mentioned before. And I've alluded to this multiple times. It often happens. You prototype so much time, you did time box yourself, you fall in love with what you did, you've polished the prototype so much, you go like, all right, so maybe we just can build on top of this so that it becomes the game. And then during production, you realize that you have a very inefficient pipeline into adding content, or your code is not running well, or all sorts of other technical issues that you have to face with, merely because you started off building a hacky mess, and then that hacky mess became your reality. This is why I recommended earlier to try in a different language first, so that you don't end up here. It happens so often that teams end up here, and that's a big problem. This is also a very common mistake amongst game developers, that they ended up prototyping the wrong things. As oftentimes the game developers, they're often excited to just prototype the things or build the things that's more fun. Building games is fun, and you want to build the fun bits first, or the things that you're more excited about. I'll give you an example about this. I was once working with a prototyping team, and we were trying to create a new meta around a rhythm game. So we wanted to do it like to utilize the basic rhythm game mechanics of a Guitar Hero or Rock Band, but we tried to have like a more interesting meta game design around that. And when the team started prototyping, they were very engaged with the project. But the first thing they prototyped and they built an engine was the notes highway, similar to what you see in Guitar Hero, is the notes coming towards the screen, and you have to tap the right combination of elements at the right tempo. The developer even that was working on that project was so invested. They were working 10 hours a day into building this in a quick amount of time. And the developer was so invested, he was also a musician. He spent a night one time composing a track to be used with the prototype. The biggest issue, though, is that even though we ran it and it played nice and the music was nice and all of that, but we already know how the notes highway work. We know that that's fun. So that prototype proved nothing. It proved that we can build it, but that's not what we're trying to test here. The key risks of what we're trying to test were not validated in the prototype, making that prototype, even though functional, a complete failure. So on that note, it's probably worth it to talk about how do we determine what to prototype. There are many different ways to do this. I'm going to give you just a small exercise that you can do with your team so that you can like figure that stuff out. So you gather your team around and we draw something on the whiteboard. This is like the x-axis. It goes from all the way to uncertain to certain, right? And then you pass up some sticky notes to your team members and you tell them, all right, so every team member grab and write one feature per sticky note. And let them write as much as they can so that you have all the features together. And then you ask those team members to take those sticky notes and distribute them on this axis. So the feature that we know that will work, or we know that people like it, or we know that we function, we've seen it work somewhere else before, or we've prototyped it before, or we have it in our previous products, etc. It goes closer to the certain part of the axis. And the things that we're not sure about, we move it towards the uncertain part. Okay? Then the next step is that we define the y-axis of like how critical it is to the project or not critical to the project. And then we start moving those sticky notes while maintaining their position, either upwards and downwards. So they have a different distribution on the squadrons, right? So this way you will identify whether a feature is certain or critical, or if it's critical to your project, mean that this project or game cannot function without this feature, and it's uncertain. And that will be the quadrant that you want to prototype first. So the features that are uncertain, that you are not sure about, or you don't know how you're going to go about them, and they're completely critical to the success of your game, those are the things you want to prototype first. The things that are critical and certain, those are the things you can just go ahead and start building. The things that are certain but not critical, those are like your nice to have additions once we built them. And then the part in which is like, these are not certain and not critical. These are like, why are we doing this? These are the features you really need to reevaluate and look at and consider, are we doing the right things by building these? So to summarize the talk so that we can have some time for Q&A, prototyping rules, it's awesome, but you also need to be abiding by the rules that you put on yourself as you're working towards them. Use the method that gives you the quickest result. The idea is to be quick and dirty as much as possible. Quick and dirty is good. It's not about being presentable. It's not about necessarily being functional. It's about proving a point and getting there as fast as possible. So you need to work fast, but you also need to work fast with a purpose. So you need to know what you're doing, why are you prototyping it, and what parts of the game that you actually need to prototype. You want to fail just as much as you want to succeed. So you need to focus on attempting to failure in a prototyping process is considered success because you just got an answer. And that's your bottom line that you need to work with. And most importantly, prototyping should be fun. So have fun and good luck in your prototyping efforts. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Fawzi. That was great. Loads of detail in there. Yes, it made me feel we've not gone into quite enough prototyping for some of the features of our show, but still, yeah, it's fantastic. Loads of useful, valuable information there. And obviously this video will be available for people to pour through later from the whole conference. Got a couple of questions I'm going to get through, and then I'm going to have to usher you into the digital ether. A question I've got here from is, how would I go about prototyping a game that is mainly focused on story? For mechanics or level design, it sounds and makes sense, but a story-driven game will depend on things like visuals, music, or atmosphere. Would you advise me to do prototyping for a story-driven game?
Absolutely, but the thing is, like, what are you trying to prototype again? It's like identifying what the prototyping aspect is. Are you trying to prototype the idea that is the story nice? Then you can probably achieve that quite quickly by, like, having people read your script and tell you if the story is nice or not. Are you trying to prototype a cliffhanger mechanic? If you want to see if cliffhangers work, then if you watch Netflix, you already know that works. You don't necessarily need to prototype that. What is the mechanic or the system that you're trying to implement that you are uncertain of? And you need to focus on prototyping that.
Fair enough. Okay.
And then finding the way to prototype that, it really depends on the thing that you want to prototype. So I mentioned if it's about finding out if your story is compelling, then it's about getting people to read it and get that feedback, perhaps. But if
Okay.
you want to find ways to prototype how people interact with that particular mechanic per se, you can find digital ways to do that. There are, for example, free tools in which you can build your own visual novel that are free to build, and it would allow you to like break down the story beats in a way to see if those are compelling within a digital way or not. So
Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to try and get through quickly 2 more, and then I'll get Adam on. So I've put us 10 minutes behind, but it's my show, so damn it, I can do what I
it's all good.
So when prototyping elder game features, what techniques do you advise to make up for the fact that prototype players haven't built up hours of knowledge with your game? Does that make sense?
Elder game features?
I don't know what elder. I presume it was a term in the games industry, but obviously maybe older game. I don't know. That's from Thomas Hooper. Maybe Thomas, you can add
Thomas, can you add a little bit more context?
Add a clarification of what older game features you mean. While Thomas is maybe typing that in, I'm going to ask you. I've got a question here about what prep work do you do before prototyping? You might have answered some of that in the talk actually, but what do you sketch user flows or information architecture? Mm-hmm. Is the prototyping work done with UX designers?
It depends on the type of prototype. So if we're trying to prototype usability on like how intuitive the project is, then UX designers will obviously have a lot of work. And working in that particular field. So like they'll be trying to test if things are intuitive and if things are working really well for them. However, if we're trying to prototype different aspects of the game, then that we need to have involved different the types of people to work around. So like I said, if we're trying to test out if the mood and the lighting of a particular game is working really well, then we're working a lot more with concept artists. If we're trying to identify a core mechanic of what we're trying to do, then we're basically drawing our core loop and we're listing down our core feature list and going like, all right, so this is critical to our game. We've never seen it in other games before. These are the things we need to identify. There's an element of research that goes into figuring out what you need to prototype. And like we look at your feature list and consider, is any of this something that I can't see in any other game, or I can't prototype or like try out myself somewhere else? And those are the things that you probably need to build and test out yourself. If you have some of these things elsewhere, then you can just try that. Give an example. I was working with the team once. They're trying to illustrate. They were trying to prototype a mechanic in which a spaceship can take off from the floor all the way to space. And I'm like, that's an interesting mechanic, but I've already seen it in No Man's Sky. So we know that it can work. So maybe we're not focusing on the right thing here. We can try to focus on other things.
Okay. I've got a kind of question, as it combines a question here and also as a question about current situation. So the first question came is, well, you've worked in the games industry all over the world. What would you say the biggest differences between countries?
Oh my God, that's a very long-winded answer. So like
maybe you get back to him on that. I don't know, but
like there's a talk I used to do about different management styles in different areas all over the world. It's maybe like a 45-minute talk, but I'll try to say that. But like to summarize it, I feel that every country applies different management techniques and different engagement techniques between people that is really taken in from the culture, and some of these things can be quite different. Early in my career, I used to think that I liked one more than the other. And I've learned over the years to accept that they're different and there's no right or wrong. They're just different perspectives.
Fair enough. And final, very short question. So, because we've talked a lot in the last few days, obviously, about how the COVID-19 crisis is affecting people working from home, and how and a lot of small developers have been quite boyish about how they've managed to run their studios. But we're seeing bigger companies delaying games, pulling back. DICE, obviously, a pretty big operation. How is DICE faring? I don't need like business details, but how are you faring? Is it all kind of still working in production as normal, or is
so far so good? So like I think by today, this is week 4 of us working from home. I need to, if there's anybody listening, I need to give a shout out to our IT team who just did amazing work. We had like the entire studio fully operational from like day 1 of working from home, which for me is mind-blowing. The trickiest part for us was, like our games are like heavy multiplayer games, so getting a lot of play testing involved was a little bit tricky to get together first, but also our IT guys really managed to get together. Huge shout out to those people. We kind of like saw it coming as a leadership team, so we started working really early on making sure that we get the right groundwork in place. So we've already collected information from everybody. Make sure that you got your VPN systems working, you get your work machines encrypted and ready to go, and then we had our teams pack them up and ship them to people's homes.
Right.
The entire team is functional. So far, so good.
It does seem the games industry seems more prepared for this than various governments have been. But on that note, I am going to thank you so much for your generous time this morning. I'm going to let you get back. You seem to have a war breaking out behind you. You might want to take.
There's always one happening.